You all today. Thank you so much for taking this time to join us. As you know, JD and I have been doing these sessions. We're on our fourth one. This one's called Listening, Innovative Listening, Learning from Those You Seek to Serve.
I'm sorry, what did you say, John? No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Number 4 of 6. Almost there, brother.
That's right. Yeah, are we really listening, right? And are we being heard?
That's not in Tennessee, or maybe in Tennessee, but not.
Yeah, I don't know where it was, but yeah, this is, with technology, this is always a challenge. And this goes to our point, right? There's a lot of things that are keeping us from listening and being listened to in the modern world that aren't even our own minds and our own disciplines, right? So we're going to focus more on the disciplines this morning, but there's a lot of other issues that can cause us not to be able to listen as well. Why don't I open us up in prayer, and then JD, I'll pitch the first question to you.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Dear God, thanks for this time we can have together. Thank you for the audience that's joining us. Pray that you would help them to take something away from this time today, help them get some insight and some new wisdom on how to listen to themselves, to you, to their team, and to their larger audience. So thank you for this time we have together in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, as we get going here, I want to start, JD, with a very simple question to you. And really, it's why do we listen? What is behind the need to listen?
Well, I don't know if you've ever heard. Well, have you ever heard this expression, John? A listener or leaders are readers. Have you ever heard that one?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of made its rounds quite frequently.
Yeah.
I haven't heard this statement as much, and it's leaders are listeners. I don't know if you've heard that or not, but I do know that leaders are talking about the importance of listening and have been for some time. So leaders are listeners. Listening leads to learning, and learning leads to innovation. And so if we can kind of keep those things in mind, I think that may be helpful to us kind of in this journey today. I read an article recently where the writer was talking about the importance of listening, and he makes this statement. He says, in the challenge of innovation, the problem is more in starting the engines of the innovation process, and it starts with the consistent flow of innovative ideas. So the need to have those ideas coming in. Without innovative ideas, the innovation process will not start. If you are the only one who talks in your company, of course, he's writing to a business group of leaders. If you're the only one who talks in your organization, in your church, I'm filling in those gaps. How can you learn something new for yourself? Simply, you can't learn while you're talking. I thought that was a pretty good point. What are your thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I think it's super important because what I found in a lot of organizations is that the leader sets this tone of I'm the one who talks, and the followers are the ones who listen. And what ends up happening is the person who leads, whether it be a small team or a large organization, never hears what the rest of the organization or the larger audience that they're trying to serve is dealing with. And so a lot of the decisions that are made in this kind of bubble around the head of the leader's perceptions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they don't have that understanding. And so, I think it's a really common challenge.
So I think if you kind of take that question, why do we talk about listening? Why do we listen? I think there are at least 5 things that are helpful for us to kind of keep in mind. And one is that listening is that means of generating ideas, of obtaining feedback, making adjustments as we go. We're listening to other people, and so we're making changes in our strategy and what we do. Listening, it's got to be done throughout the entire innovation process. A second reason I think that's important for us to listen is we listen obviously for understanding. So, for example, at the end of the letter to the Colossian church, Paul is talking about his desire for the church to pray for God to open up an opportunity for him to share the gospel. And he makes this statement. He talks about walking in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be seasoned with salt. And he says, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Now, clearly the context is in an evangelistic situation, but I think there's a principle there, and I think it's important for us to recognize that even within the church, we need to be good listeners. We need to be good listeners from those that are around us. I mean, if you think about the way Jesus engaged people, he would ask them questions. He would hear their responses. Samaritan woman, of course, that's outside the church. That's an evangelistic situation. But we see throughout the scripture this notion of the importance of listening for proper understanding, so that we can know how we can respond to people. A third thing that, John, that comes to my mind when it comes to why we need to listen is so that we can assist others in their growth in their faith, growth in their leadership in God's kingdom. Think about Acts chapter 8. So John, Philip's out there in the middle of nowhere. He runs up to the Ethiopian eunuch, and the eunuch is he's reading from Isaiah, and instead of Philip just jumping into a message, do you remember what he says to him?
He says, "Do you understand?" Right?
Yeah. He asks him that question. Do you understand? And so the man speaks, and based on how that man responds to Philip's question, Philip begins talking to him about who Christ is. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I've experienced this over and over. I think I love the fact that you put this one in there in those reasons, because what I've noticed is if you hear from someone, if you're listening to them, usually the best way to help them grow and develop is to listen more and to ask them questions that help them come to an understanding of what they need. It is so much more powerful for someone to be able to grow and develop when they thought of it rather than someone told them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just think about that with your kids, right? If it was your kid's idea, they think it's great, right? If it's the parents' idea, then it's suspect, right? Well, what do my parents want me to do? Why do they want me to do it? But if they came up with it, then they're all for it, right? And
I think that's a good point. I mean, that kind of leads to the fourth reason that I was thinking about, and that is listening builds trust. And so if I'm a person asking those questions, asking those open-ended questions, letting that person respond, kind of, guiding in that process, I mean, it sets me up as someone who's transparent. I mean, it sets me up as someone who's seeking to at least try to listen well. And at least in most Western contexts today, the person who listens well is often seen as a caring person. And so, that's going to be helpful. And then it kind of brings us, I think, to at least the fifth reason that comes to my mind about the importance of listening is listening leads to influence. We listen not to learn how to manipulate people, but we listen so that we know how to mobilize people to what the Lord has called us to do in the process of innovating with this team. So here's an idea, John, that I've been thinking about. A lot of leaders will say, but if I'm the leader, aren't people supposed to be listening to me? Shouldn't I be the one who is always doing the talking and they need to be quiet? I mean, have you ever come across that?
Yeah, I think to that point, I think that there's this sense that the leader can feel like they have to have the answer because that's kind of in their job description.
I mean, I think you're exactly right. Yeah. We're the professionals. We've got to have the answer all the time.
And I think part of what we need to do is change the job description of an innovator or a leader, right? An innovator, who many times is a leader in one situation or another, feels like they're the smart ones with all the new cool ideas, so they've got to be saying what new cool thing they found out. When in fact, a really good leader, a really good innovator is always saying, there's an idea somewhere in each person I meet, right?
Yeah.
And that makes a big difference in how their perspective.
Yeah, I think about like Proverbs 12:15. It comes to my mind. The verse says, the way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise person listens to advice.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that applies to kind of what you were saying. I mean, if we're leaders, we don't need to act like we know it all. In fact,
right,
no one knows it all. And if we come across with that demeanor, I think it cuts down on our credibility, and I think it hinders the innovation process. I think that notion of listening and asking good questions is part of our role as being a leader. And I know you and I've talked before about the importance of the Holy Spirit, in that process of the people that we're trying to serve and seeking to understand what's the Lord saying and doing in and through them.
Yeah.
How about this one, John? What do you see is the connection between listening and learning? Because learning is so
Yeah.
important in this whole process.
That's right. Yeah. When we think about innovating, right, we're innovating is a process of learning what new solutions need to be created, right? And so then the question you have to ask is, well, what's the role of listening in that, right? So
Mhm.
listening isn't simply to take in information and then do nothing with it, right?
Right.
A leader that is innovating has to be doing something with the listening that they're doing. But I think one of the things that's important to note is that simply listening is not necessarily mean that you're learning. Meaning, listening can be done as a courtesy. We've all met a leader or an innovator who
Yeah.
wants to hear your opinion, or they have you do a survey, and then they go and they obviously did not read it or apply it in
That's a
any way.
good word. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we can't assume that listening leads to learning,
Mm-hmm.
but we should desire that listening lead to learning. The way I describe it kind of is this idea that listening can be a gateway to learning. And so for that to be the case, a few things have to be true. I think you have to see every person in your life as someone who has something to teach you, right? And that's a real perspective thing, because a lot of times when we walk around in the world and we see the people, that we walk by in the hallway or walk by out on the street or at a coffee shop, our first impression isn't to go, wow, what could I learn from that person? Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not our first thought that comes to our mind. A
Right.
lot of times we're like, annoyed by those people, or we're ignorant, or we're just not even thinking about what they might know. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so this idea that by listening, I can actually unlock information that can be really, really helpful to what I'm trying to learn. That whole concept, I think, is not always what's forefront in our minds. So I think what it takes is it takes us changing how we see the people in front of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whether I'm in a focus group, I was just in a focus group a week or two ago, where we had it was an amazing opportunity. It was an amazing group of they were all Christians who went to church at least once a month or 4 times a month, somewhere in there, professing Christians, but not necessarily involved in missions at all. And we were listening to what they thought about missions.
Mm-hmm.
And and I had to come in saying, these people who are people I would walk along the street by and not even know they were Christians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Average Joe and Jane up in Denver, Colorado. I had to say, what can I learn about how they view the church? That I
Yeah.
don't already know. And I had
Yeah.
to think that way going into that time. And I learned a lot.
Yeah.
It was very, very helpful time. But I think one of the things that is, I just want to camp on it for a minute and then ask you kind of where you sit on this, JD, because I think each of us is different. I think listening is extremely helpful for auditory learners, meaning if you are a learner that learns by
Mm-hmm.
talking and by processing verbally,
Yeah.
listening is an extremely helpful thing. That's how I'm wired personally.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a higher value for it. Other people learn by reading, right? By diving in and processing logically and reading the argument, or other people learn by doing, right? They get out there and they watch the YouTube video and then they do it with their hands and they practice. I think if you are more of a reader or a logical processor, or if you're more of a doer, this kind of learning is harder for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're more of an auditory learner, this is just kind of like the water in which you swim. This is what you do, right? What's the way you're wired, JD? What do you
Yeah.
think?
I prefer to take in information primarily, just through hearing.
Okay.
And in fact, this morning, I was reading over some things, and I stopped after about 5 minutes and thought, I don't have a clue what I just read. I mean, I don't even. I mean, I can give a few ideas, but I don't really even remember what I read. So, I think I learn best by doing. And when you bring all that together, hearing and seeing and doing, you learn and retain more. That's not always the most efficient way to lead in an innovation process, if you've got a lot of people, though, that I think it's an important part of that process, and the leaders that can lead their teams to do that. I mean, I think that's top flight in just the in the learning process. But I do think that this skill, at least in a predominantly Western context, I think that this skill of just learning how to be a better listener, listening well, understanding your people, so that you may know how to adjust your leadership style. So, I mean, I'm oftentimes thinking everybody's like me, right? So I prefer to learn primarily through listening. But what if I have people in my group that prefer to take in information primarily through reading or through, they're task oriented? Well, I probably can't accommodate to that all the time. Obviously, right. I expect them to adjust to me just as I'm adjusting to them. But maybe some of the time I need to lead through maybe a written format and get that into certain people's hands, or develop some sort of task for people to if we can use the word experiment with, to learn from. But it is, I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, I think it's always going to be a challenge just because of the different learning styles of a lot of people.
Yeah, but I think knowing your learning style and then positioning the role of listening within that, right?
Yeah.
Because it'll always have a role.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of some people need it as a more core part of how they learn, and other people, they have to force it because it's not so natural to them.
Yeah.
But it doesn't ever mean that it's not important, right?
Right.
When we think about, especially I think about, when you're doing your innovation work and you're creating something to solve someone's problem, if you haven't listened to them about that problem, right? So if someone has a problem that you think is described in this way, you've described it, you've defined it, and if you haven't really listened to them describe the problem, if you just kind of intuited, yeah, this is a problem, a lot of people have it, I need to solve it, I can guarantee you're going to miss the boat. Because what I've found, every time I stop and listen to how they describe their problem that I'm trying to solve, I find they describe it differently than I thought they were going to.
Oh, yeah.
Every time. Yeah. Well, now let's kind of jump a little more into some of the how-tos. And JD, I want to ask you, what are some of the challenges to listening in a kingdom setting, particularly, that you've noticed?
There are three that come to my mind, and I mean, they're pretty basic. I mean, just when you begin to think about the overall challenges that are there, I mean, I think first challenge would be the challenge of listening. That's a challenge that's internal to me as a leader. Proverbs 18, chapter 18, verse 3 says that if one gives an answer before he hears, it is to his folly and shame. I think about so many times how I've got all these different ideas and concepts in my mind and challenges before me related to work-related matters. I'm thinking about a conversation my wife and I just had. I'm thinking about a conversation I had with one of my children, and all that's going on while I'm in the presence of this individual or this team that I'm leading. And I'm processing and thinking that my mind's turning in that direction while they're talking and speaking to me. And oftentimes I'm only getting bits and pieces. And so the result of that is sometimes I am already formulating an answer based on just a snippet. And I've already got my answer decided before I hear the answer, or before I hear the person's response. And so, Proverbs 18:3 is just a verse that just, resonates with me, because I feel like that I am one that is quick to come up with an answer even before the person is done talking. I remember one time I really embarrassed myself. I don't think the person caught it, but I really embarrassed myself. And it's just an example of going against what this passage says. I remember hearing someone talking, and as soon as they said some kind of word, it was just a trigger to me, and I formulated my response, my answer. In that process of their monologue with me, they shifted gears and went into a different direction and then asked me a question related to that other direction. I answered based on the initial direction that they were going. And I missed the the cutoff in the conversation. And I just corrected myself. But I was so embarrassed. One of the coolest book titles I've ever seen, and I wish it hadn't been put out there, because I would put it on my next book. Is a book by Ron Johnson. It's on preaching and personal evangelism, and the title is called "How Will They Hear If We Do Not Listen?" How will they hear if we do not listen? It's on the importance of us listening. So there's that challenge that's internal to me. I think there's also that challenge of listening that's internal to the team. So so the team, if we got 2 or 3 people on our team, I mean, that's a lot of diversity. I mean, wouldn't you think so? I mean, got different passions and gifts and things of that matter. And so again,
and competing things,
oh
right?
yeah,
Competing
and
ideas,
what you're
competing
saying a moment
priorities.
ago, learning styles.
Exactly.
I mean, that's huge. You know, again, I'll kind of jump back to Proverbs here for some thoughts, but like Proverbs 27, 23 and 24 says, know well the condition of your flocks and give attention to your herds, for riches do not last forever, and does a crown endure for all generations. And it's what's the principle there that we can think about? It's not so much that we're shepherds and we're trying to get riches out of these people, but the principle is, you know, understand the people that's a part of your stewardship, that's a part of what has been entrusted into your hands, because they're living and they're adjusting, and things of that nature are critical to know, you know, the health of the people and where they're going, because that's going to affect your leadership style. So the internal things to the teams, internal things to me, and then one last thing that I think may be helpful for us to keep in mind is that another challenge for listening is just what I call the static between us, between you and me, between me and someone else, and that is the external distractions that exist in real time. So, you know, how many times have you've been watching a show? It's a really serious moment in the movie. There's a husband and wife together. They're talking about something serious. Maybe it's a romantic part. And all of a sudden someone's phone rings. And what do? You know, even on TV. Oh, I've got to take this call. I mean, it's like the most serious moments in the whole movie, and they're distracted by a phone ringing or something like that. And so there's that. I mean, there's distractions going on around us, people coming in, talking to us while we're trying to communicate with people. David Hasselgrave wrote a great book years ago called Communicating Christ Cross-Culturally. And in that book, he talks about being receptor-oriented in our communication. In other words, we're asking as we're speaking, how are people receiving what I am speaking, even my body language? Am I trying to focus on them and not be distracted by the phone? I put the phone away. It buzzes in my pocket. I just let it buzz. I turn it off. But we've got to deal with this static, because I think that's a tremendous hindrance to the listening process.
Yeah, you know, I think related to that, I think, you know, when we think about the times that Jesus took his disciples away, right? You know, and got away from the crowds. I mean, think about how distracting a lot of the time that the disciples and Jesus had together, right?
That's a good
There
point.
were crowds, there were naysayers, there was drama, all these things going on all around. But Jesus was very intentional to take that time so that the listening and the communicating was at a higher quality. He recognized, you know, when that was really not happening at the level he wanted it to happen, and he was sensitive to that.
Yeah, you know, and you mentioning that about Jesus's approach, you know, where he's with his disciples, when he's with other people, he often is asking questions. Yes, he makes the declarative statements, but he's often asking questions. And you said some things earlier about questioning that I want to ask you about, John. Not all questions are the same. So can you kind of speak to maybe the difference between different types of questions, because that's how we get at this learning? I know something you've talked to me about is what you talk about the power of the second question, but can you kind of help us understand the importance of the difference that we have there in questions?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, yeah, that idea of the power of the second question comes from a book. I've got it right here, by Chris Skillett, called "The Power of the Second Question." Really would recommend it, and because what he does is he articulates in a fairly compelling way something we all know, but we don't practice a lot, right? Let me just read how he describes a second question. He says, "We call them second questions because they usually follow on from a series of factual questions that simply exchange information. Second questions are qualitatively different from the more frequently asked factual questions. They provide an extra dimension to a conversation. They lift us up, they open a door. They're usually big picture, conceptual questions that require the respondent to pause and consider before they reply. You know, when I think about listening, in my mind, this ability to move from the first kinds of questions to the second kinds of questions, I think is the art, right? You know, we talk about
Mm.
the science of it.
Yeah.
Now we talk about the art of it, right? And
Yeah.
this is the art of it. So I think about in the life of Jesus, specifically in Luke 18, 8 through 30, when he's talking to the rich young
Oh yeah.
ruler.
Mm-hmm.
And the rich young ruler asks him a fairly factual question. He says, "Good teacher, how do I get into heaven?
Yeah.
You know, how do I make that work?"
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus responds with seemingly a fairly odd question. He says, essentially, "Why do you call me good?" And I was reading that this week and processing that, and what Jesus was doing there was he was identifying the true problem.
Mm.
He was saying, "Hey, you don't really believe that I'm God. You just believe that I'm some good guy giving you some good wisdom.
Mm.
And so you're asking me to tell you what you already know." That's what he was kind of
Mm.
wanting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so what Jesus was doing with his second question was he was saying, "Why do you call me good?" Because what he really wanted him to understand was that I'm not just some good guy giving you some good advice like the other good guys giving you more good advice. I'm actually the God of the universe. So
Mm.
when you ask me that question, I'm going to tell you,
Mm.
what does it mean to get into heaven from God's perspective,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And so I think about that then from now. Obviously, we're not God, so we're not asking that deep of a question. But we're saying things like someone we may ask a first question like um like where did you grow up? And I can easily answer, well, I grew up, I was a missionary kid. I grew up in Argentina, right? So I can answer that question. Well, if someone were to follow up that question with a question like, what one lesson or what one lesson, yeah, a lesson is the right word. What one lesson did you learn as a child growing up there that
Mm-hmm.
really had an impact on you even till today,
Yeah.
right? That is a second question that has me go underneath the
Yeah.
surface.
Yeah. It digs deeper into the conversation, the relationship at that moment.
Absolutely, and dig deeper into the understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the same is true if you're doing innovation work. If I say, "Do you like the website?" Right? Someone could say, "Yeah, I like the navigation," or "The pictures are cool," or they can give you this basic factual information about your thing that you've developed. But
Right.
if you say, if you were to share this website with a friend of yours, how would you share it with them, or what would you tell them about it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense? Have you ever
Yeah.
experienced a
It
second
does.
question?
Yeah. I mean, I think it gets more specific, and I think that it also helps us to clarify that. Well, it helps us to help the person or the people that we're leading to know that we're processing, we're
Yeah,
journeying with them in this innovation process. And so, what I'm going to do as a leader, rather than make it look like I've got it all figured out, I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask this deeper level question.
right.
Now, I may already have an idea of where you're going to go with that question or the answer to that. I may not. But even if I don't know where you're going to go, you're going to help me understand. If I do know, and your response confirms what I was thinking, it shows again. It shows an openness. It shows a willingness to move in that direction. Um, so let me pitch this question to you then, John, about the discipline of asking questions. So how does that then make us more innovative? What can you kind of help us think through that?
Yeah, I think this maybe gets to the crux of the connection, right?
Yeah.
So I think at the base level, innovation is created to solve someone's problem.
Hmm.
Someone has a problem that isn't being solved by the current solutions, whatever they might be.
Right.
And we then, as the innovator, go, I want to solve that problem better. I want to address that issue
Hmm.
in a way that actually addresses the new set of situations that have occurred that are causing it not to be met the way it used to be met.
So
And
it's
so,
helping us to understand the
yeah,
problems.
yeah. And so listening comes in, I think, when you're saying, so if my solution should be solving your problem, do I really understand your problem?
Hmm.
Um, and again, it goes back to something I said a few minutes ago. I have found that most of the time, the way I have perceived someone's problem is really only scratching the surface of what it
Hmm.
really is. And
Uh-huh.
so I'll get a sense for someone's problem. I'll say, oh, that's a problem out in the market or out in my community or whatever. I'll say, I know the answer, and I'll immediately jump
Yeah.
again because we don't like to listen too long. We like
Yes.
to kind of ideate quickly.
Yes.
I'll immediately jump and say, oh, I got an answer for that, right?
Hmm.
But what I found is when I go back and test those hypotheses, so many times, what I thought was the answer isn't really what they needed. Um,
Hmm.
and so this discipline of going, okay, I've identified a problem that involves some level of listening. Um, I've immediately come up with what I think are some solutions. Now, can I go back in an intentional way into the community of people that I seek to serve?
Hmm.
And can I ask them, does this solution really address that problem?
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So you're bringing your team and, for lack of a better term, that audience, that group that you're
yeah,
seeking to influence even more, bringing those worlds together.
that's right. And and what you're doing is you're giving some disciplined ways, whether it's focus groups, whether it's just going out talking one on one, whether it's surveys, um, whether it's discussions with some of the people like that you're working with who are closer to the problem than you are.
Hmm.
You're you're using all those mechanisms to listen and go, am I truly understanding
Yeah.
what we need to be designing in the solution we're creating?
Yeah.
Um,
That's good.
and I don't know if you've experienced that ever, where either someone has asked you to better understand a problem, or you've asked someone to better understand a problem. JD, is that something you've experienced?
Yeah. I mean, no, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't have to walk along in leadership before that's going to be the case, and being in touch with that larger community, or at least samples of that larger community, is really really important, because we and our teams can become isolated. We can think
Yeah,
that we know what the people out there are asking about, or concerned about, or troubled over, or struggling with. Um, and sometimes we may be right, sometimes we may be wrong, but why not spend some time listening to that larger community? I mean, I think that's a part of the innovative process as well. I mean, you know, changes in technology, the way we consume media, view media, things of that nature.
yeah,
I mean, that's part of it. That's happened. We see the results of that as a result of secular organizations, listening to others around them.
right. No, really important. Well, we want to take time to
Yeah.
answer questions. So I'm going to read off a few questions. I'll tee them up. I'm going to start with one from Greg. He says, listening must also include a wide range of voices. Too often the church only listens to the loudest voice, the majority voice. Even think of how we do Robert's Rules of Orders or those kind of
Mhm.
things, when we're talking about meetings. Um, how have you worked to assure that you're listening personally and communally to a diversity of voices, e.g., people of color, introvert, extrovert, older, younger, all these kind of things? And so that's a great question, JD.
It is.
What's your sense for how you've done that?
Well, I mean, the only way to listen is to engage
Mm,
in those various categories, and so
yeah,
you can't sit around. You can't take one of those groups that's monolithic and sit around and talk about, okay, what do these other groups think, and only go with that. Now, there's a place for that if you and your team happen to be fairly monolithic, but you have to get, or homogenous, but you have to get out there and you have to talk. You have to engage. You have to connect with other people. I mean,
right.
that's you got to put feet to the pavement. As we
But
say.
in this, especially in a cross-cultural or a missions context, right? This
Right.
becomes so critical. I think you have to put yourself in places. I think the missionaries that I've seen,
Yeah.
observed, watched, who are the most effective are ones that
Mhm.
insert themselves
Yeah.
into places that are other, right?
Yeah.
I worked with a wonderful gentleman. We were working on a book on immigrants, and he spent time at the local mosque, right, as he was working on the book with me, right,
Mhm.
which of course that's what he should be doing, right? He was
Right.
listening to to immigrants from a community that he never ran into just on a day-to-day basis,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, I
And
mean
he
it's the
listened,
whole critical contextualization piece. I mean
right?
you have God's word, you have you and your team, and then or in the critical that Paul Hebert talked about the missionary team, and then you have that indigenous church, that contextualized church, and so the missionaries aren't the only ones that are coming up with the answers. They're engaging the nationals that are there, and so yes, we have to get out there and get out of our comfort zone in many cases. Good
Yeah,
question.
I think and to Greg's point, we have to be really intentional to seek out voices that just would not typically be heard. I think
Right.
I just my sense has been, I've tried. I think one of the ways to do that is especially if you don't necessarily have access to a lot of different people really
Mm-hmm.
easily from where you are, for whatever reason logistically. One of the things I've done recently is I've used a survey company where I've had them be able to get me a sample of people that would
Wow.
go across cities, across race, gender, all these things, and force myself to hear people that I might even have trouble getting access to,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
that could be another way to deal with it. Um, Jerry has a question. He says, second question sound a lot like the five whys, a technique used a lot in business, a great reminder. Great point. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's like journalism, right? Who, what, where, when, why,
And how?
all those things are great
Yeah.
components of listening well. Yeah.
Yeah. No, good point. Good observation.
Okay. We got Dana saying in cross cultural settings, listening is not just a matter of silence so someone can talk, it often involves body language, setting issues, and group dynamics that influence who we should talk to
Hmm.
and what listening means. Can you comment on how innovation opportunities can change based on the group composition and timing? That's a
Yeah.
really good one.
Good point. I mean, I think again, it goes back to you being a learner of that context and to those people, and and just be open with them and say, I want to learn. I want to know. I want to understand more. Tell me. Explain to me. Um, and welcome critique. Welcome. Public rebuke, so to speak. In other words, I've told people when I've been in those situations, I've said, "Hey, if I stand in a certain way, if I hold my hands in a certain way, if I make certain gestures in a certain way, stop me and say, hey, this is not appropriate here." And so we as leaders, we've got to be again learners and receptive to that. That will help us in that process.
Yeah. When you think about the group dynamic, you know, I think one of the ways we prove we're good listeners is by how intentionally we involve all the people in the group.
Mm-hmm.
I think that ability to bring in a person that's being quiet, right, that isn't saying anything, or that ability of in a loving way, kind of saying to someone who's dominating the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
let's listen to some other people,
Yeah.
or you know,
And
just
there's
the
and there's
way we manage that, right?
yeah, I mean, and there's so much. I mean, from society to society, that's going to shift. I mean, if a society is more patriarchal
True.
than matriarchal, or matriarchal and patriarchal, I mean, there's certain things that I think we're going to have to obviously say this isn't the way that I like it to go. This is not the way that I want it to go, but maybe that's how it has to be. I've got to go talk to these two people or these three people
Right.
first before I talk to anyone else, or I have
Yeah.
to get them to tell me what I need to do, or I may let them talk the whole time, but then I know that after I step out of the room, then everybody's going to talk. So I mean, there's just so many things from society to society that's out there. So many different elements that can affect us being receptor oriented.
Yeah, I think one of those is, we took a look at Hofstede's ideas around power distance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's such a
Yeah.
key one, right? I've been in rooms where it is only appropriate for the one leader to respond to what I say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I know behind the scenes that one leader is actually involving and listening to that
Yes.
whole group. And
Yeah.
one example, we just had something recently. We were doing a prototype, and we were doing something in a village in Kenya, and we had a participatory activity with leaders in the community and teachers and parents, and it was so fascinating to see how it went. What happened was there was discussion about the topic in the morning, and there was discussion back and forth, and multiple people had different ideas. and of course the I don't know that there were any Westerners in the group, but there were people from the big city, right, from the
Mm-hmm.
capital in Nairobi, and then this was a small village on the coast, and so at lunchtime, the most of the group went away to eat lunch, and they came back and they were of one mind, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a great example
Yeah.
of allowing for different ways that people listen and make decisions,
Mm-hmm.
because what needed to happen in that group was they needed to not be in the presence of the foreigner or the
Yeah.
person from out of their
Yeah.
building,
Yeah.
so they could make the final decision,
Mm-hmm.
and we had to give them room for that, or else they wouldn't have been able to be heard.
Yeah.
You know. Yep. Um, Greg makes a great kind of follow-up point to what we were saying. He says he's concerned that the response to his question went straight to mission field. Those varied voices are not primary targets, but equal partners in our real communities locally. I think that's a great point. We want to make sure that it's so easy for an innovator to get into an us-them dynamic,
Right.
where I'm the innovator and they're the audience, or I'm the missionary and they're the person receiving the gospel. We really have to force ourselves to get out of the us them dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
but it's sure not easy, right?
Right.
It's so natural for us to kind of get stuck
Yeah.
in that us then thinking. So that's a great reminder
Yeah.
from Greg on that. Yep. Another question from Rebecca. As you shared about seeing each other in our life as someone to learn from, what are practical ways you have taken steps to own this mindset? Um, let's see here. What comes to your mind, JD?
Help me. John? What do you think is meant by seeing each other in our life?
Well, I think what Rebecca's saying is has to do with seeing people not as objects or as things to ways to get things done, but as
Right.
people who have something we can learn from. I guess what I would say to that, because I was the one that mentioned it, so I'll go first on that one. Is to force myself to not think in transactional ways, but think in transformational ways. So
Mm-hmm.
transactionally, I want to use people to get my thing done. So
Right. Mm-hmm.
if I have a project I'm getting done, I want to use people to accomplish a objective or a goal. And so
Mm-hmm.
I don't care about what they think or feel. I just say, what do they have that I need to get my
Right.
job? But when I think transformationally, like I think like the process is as important as the end result, then I begin to say, as I get my job done, what's God doing in their life?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I do that, it forces me to say, this isn't just about the end result. This is about what God's doing in their life,
Yeah.
what they know, what
Right.
I can learn from them. So that transformation versus transaction kind of helps me change that mindset. I don't know what does it for you, JD.
Yeah. I mean, I really come down on the side of being more task oriented than being more relational in
Mm,
my orientation, and so I have to just guard my heart in that process
yeah,
that I don't allow the accomplishment of the task to be something that along that journey of innovating, I wreck the relationships. That's ungodly. And so I have to find myself, giving that over to the Lord, guiding, seeking His guidance, confessing my sins, going to people and apologizing. Now, there's a place for us, task-oriented people, of course, but at the same time, that's for those of us that tend to be in that direction. We're going to have to be cautious.
yeah. I think the other thing that I think helps is for me to see the accomplishing of the goal as not primarily my responsibility. If I see the accomplishing of that innovation project that we're working on
Mm-hmm.
as the group's responsibility,
Yeah.
then I immediately take my frame of mind out of this is me getting people to help me,
Right.
which is just so natural for humans.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how we're wired, right? It's
Yeah.
not. We're just wired that way to think about the self.
Yeah.
But when I say this is our job to get to the end result, then immediately I have to go, well, what does this person or that person or the
Mm-hmm.
other person have? Like right now, in the prototype project that I'm working on, in the innovation project, I ran into a problem that in one of the pieces of the prototype, and I really don't have the answer. And I realized that my team, they may have a way to think about it that I've never thought about. In fact, it has to do with we're setting up this book club product. So it's got to do with people who are avid readers, and I know that my group are avid readers. And so
Mhm.
what I had to do was say, you know what? My job isn't just to get a solution to this problem I've run into. My job is to go to my team and say, hey, team, this is a problem we're going to run into. I don't really have an answer for it. What do you
Mhm.
think an answer might be a godly way to respond
Yeah,
to this particular situation? You know?
that's good.
All right, another question from Les. He says, transactional listening might be listening just enough to identify how you can mobilize a person, for example. The second and third and fourth questions also seem like a good answer, showing you care as you are listening. So essentially getting beyond questions as a means to an end to questions as
Hmm.
an end in themselves.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
what's that old adage that we have here in the States? People don't care how much you know until they
I
know
think
how
that's
much
how
you
much-
care.
Yep,
So I mean, there's a lot of truth to that.
that's a great
Um,
point.
a lot of
Yeah,
truth to that. There have
yeah.
been leaders over the years that I have served with that because they were more humble, or let me say it this way, because they were humble, because they were bringing me along on that journey. They wanted to hear from me, not that they had to always agree with me, and because they showed care. Um, I I look back on those times of serving with them with much greater delight, enjoyment, and excitement than I do times when I serve with leaders that hit a lot more home runs, but
Uh-huh.
they had very little care. They had very
Yeah.
little, interest in what you had to say.
One thing that also comes to my mind is that when we are listening as part of our leading, um, the listening becomes a way not only that we show care, which is really critical, um, but that we create an environment of showing that everyone's ideas are important.
Mm-hmm.
It almost like sets the tone in a way. If I am a listener and I am actively listening all the time, then it pushes people to say that's a value here,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's it's not just a
Yeah,
token thing.
and it does not mean that you'll agree with them or that the
Yeah.
team's going to go in that direction. But you're right. It's that value that we're striving for that is a part of that innovative process.
I want to hit on what you just said, JD. I think this is another key thing. Listening and agreeing are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think as leaders, this is a real challenge for us. I think sometimes we feel, especially in a day where truth is seen a little more relatively, and it's hard to nail people down on how on we're going to do it this way because everyone has their own opinion and everyone
Mm-hmm.
can back that up with a set of studies and all these sorts of things. Um, to be a good listener does not mean that you have to do everything that you hear from other people.
Right.
I think one of the things that people really value is, and this comes up a lot in innovation projects, I've seen at least, because you have to listen a lot, and you're going to listen to a lot of your team members, board members, you're going to listen to a lot of
Mm-hmm.
audience members. They're not all going to say that the problem is the same.
Right.
In the end, you're going to have to synthesize what you're hearing,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to have to pick a direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that direction may not be what everyone wishes you did.
Yeah, and depending on your cultural context in which you're serving, the way you respond to everyone's answers is going to be different. And
Yeah,
so how I would respond in one situation may be more blunt when we hear a variety of ideas and thoughts.
yeah,
Someone suggests something, and it definitely is really out of line with where that team is. Doesn't mean I'm telling that person's a bad idea or I'm shooting the value, I'm breaking our value system, but I may be more blunt in my response. And okay, let's move on to the next person who's going to have the thought. But in another context, I may find myself that in a situation whereby that culture requires me not to be as straightforward and blunt in that
yeah,
moment. And so again, it goes back to being a learner and understanding the environment in which you find yourself.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I think in honor shame cultures, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, you really have to direct that dissonant idea or that more conflicting thing through a third party
Mm-hmm.
in order to have it received and understood and valued and not to have that person lose face. And so you're absolutely right. You may be, if you're in a setting where there's cultures that process disagreement differently, you
Mm-hmm.
may have to explain why you're not taking their idea in a different way, not
That's,
just saying,
mm,
sorry, we're not going to do that one, let's move on. You
yeah,
may
yeah,
have to say it in a different way,
yeah.
but you still have to say it. You can't just ignore it,
Mm-hmm.
and because that's dishonoring of that person as well.
Mm-hmm.
One more question, and then we'll wrap up, JD.
Okay,
Dana
sounds
again
great.
says, because innovation often occurs when two different domains of knowledge and experience interact, we can increase innovation by bringing stories and metaphors from different worlds together around a common passion. Personally, I try to read broadly to expand my set of paradigms. Can you comment on ways to make this sort of innovation happen by intentionally involving different parties and perspectives in problem solving? Are there key ways to bring the right people into a conversation or enough people from the right groups into a conference or project team?
Mhm.
That's a great observation.
Yeah, it is. I mean, for me, if I have or if I experience an idea, a different metaphor, idea, concept, um, based on something I'm reading, I'm hearing, sometimes I'll just bring it. I'll just say bring it to the table and work and just tell your team, hey, I want you to hear about this article that I just finished reading. I want you to hear about this idea. What are your thoughts? And I mean, it may be completely different than what anything the team has thought about before. But I think that what you can do is you can use that third party as sort of the um, I don't want to say scapegoat, but you can kind of put the focus, the attention on that third party rather than on yourself. Because if you bring it to the table and say, "Hey, let's do this," and the people are just so overwhelmed, it may be difficult for you as a leader. I know we talked about leadership credibility in another session, but if you could come out and say, "Hey, John Doe, Jane Doe, from this other part of the world, this other corporation, they talked about this. What do you all think about this?" For me, putting it on that third party allows us to get into that conversation related to shifting maybe our ideas.
That's a great thought. I think the other part of that Dana spoke about was designing who's in the room. I think um, being able to listen well is dependent on who you're listening to. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think one of the things that Dana is saying that I really appreciate, I think is really valuable, JD, is that you can be really intentional about who's in the room for certain discussions. Like, there are times when the CEO in your organization should be in the room
Mm-hmm.
because they have a lot to add. There are times when actually you should have a different set of people. Maybe the COO, the finance person, is a better
Mm-hmm.
person to have in the room, or maybe you need a vendor who's actually providing you part of the solution in the room, or maybe you need some audience members, some people who are using what you're going to be creating.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they need to be in the room. Designing who's in the room is key to you being able to then listen well,
That's good.
and that takes some forethought, right? You got
Yeah,
to kind of think ahead a little bit
it does.
to get the right people in the room because that does take some logistics.
Good point.
Yep.
Good point.
Well, JD, why don't you share with us our assignment for the coming month?
All right, talking about our homework. So we talked a few moments about being receptor oriented in our communication that David Hasselgrave talked about many years ago in one of his books. In other words, how are other people hearing me or receiving what I'm sending out, what I'm transmitting to them? And so I'm asking myself, that question while I'm speaking. So here's your homework assignment. So we want to encourage you to consider practicing being receptor oriented in at least three, hopefully more, but in at least three conversations over the next month before we meet again. And so I want you to begin by asking the question, how's this person or this group, how are they hearing me? And then while you're asking yourself that question, then pay attention and focus on the person that's speaking to you. Then at the same time, withhold any judgments. Let them speak. Hold back your judgments. Take a quick moment to reflect. Summarize to them what you've just heard them say. So I heard you say this. Is that what you're talking about? And then share with that person what you're hearing from them. Now, after that, and you get away from that situation, evaluate yourself. How well did you do? So how well did you do in thinking about, how are these people receiving what I'm communicating? Am I focused? Am I paying attention? Am I withholding my judgment while they're speaking? Am I reflecting? Can I summarize this and state it back to them? And all this happens in real time, while you're engaging people. So I want you to try that at least in 3 conversations over the next month to move in this direction of being more active in our listening.
Great. And then we're gonna just talk for a minute about our assignment for the next week. Not assignment. Sorry.
Topic.
The conversation.
Yeah.
What the next conversation is going to be about. We are going to be focused, and I'm just pulling it up because I had lost it there for a minute. Yeah, on September 24th is our next time together, and at 10 a.m. Eastern, so the same time as we have been doing all these conversations. And our topic for next time will be from vision to reality, acting on your idea. So what we want to focus on next time is this whole area of prototyping, experimenting, testing, actually getting from paper and getting from, conceptualizing it, writing it up, and describing it, to actually doing it out in the field where it's in action. It is being used by someone.
Yeah.
And so that's a key part of this process. One of the things that JD and I have both observed, and I'm sure many of you have observed it as well, is that in the nonprofit world, it's easy to talk about it. It's easy to write a paper about it. It's a whole lot harder to put yourself out there and just try it. Not only because we don't always have the resources, we're afraid of failure. There's a lot of reasons why that's true. So we want to really help you think through that in a kingdom way. And so that's our session. So September 24th, bookmark that in your calendars, and we will send you reminders. So don't worry about that. This video will be available for you and to use with your teams. One of the things we really encourage you to do is to take this talk once it's available on video, and take your team maybe a week or 2 from now. Watch at least the first half together, maybe not the question part, but the first half, and then use it as a discussion starter, really to help your team to interact and process and work through and kind of go through this time. So we're hoping that's a real benefit for you. I wonder, JD, if you'd wrap us up in prayer, and then we can be done.
Certainly. Father, we thank you for your grace to us today, that we can have the means to be able to have this conversation and be able to have some interaction with those that have been participating. Lord, let us be people that are slow to speak and quick to hear. And Lord, let us be leaders that listen well. May you bridle our tongues, and may you muzzle our lips when they need to be bound. And Lord, may you loosen our tongues, and may you loosen our lips when we need to speak. May we be leaders that speak as people who communicate truth that is refreshing, is empowering, and is encouraging and building up others in the body. We give thanks today, Lord, for your goodness and your grace to us. And may the things that we do when it comes to listening and when it comes to innovation be used by you to advance your gospel, to strengthen your church, to expand your kingdom. And we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you all. Good to be with you.
See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.